So thank you for the collection of questions, and I'll try to, I've organized them according to category, and I'll try to answer effectively or in order. So the first question is about the division between my camp and the camp of Redeker, Ritchie, Hanna, etc. So I think that people like Redeker and Ritchie and Starkey were interested in pirates from the start. You know, they were interested in pirates, and so they were looking at pirates, and they were looking at pirates' lives and experiences, and they approached the sources on piracy with an eye to that. You know, so court cases, privateering commissions, trade laws, etc., to see how they impacted the lives and work of pirates. I was not a piracy specialist. As an imperial historian, I was interested not so much in the pirates themselves, but in state bureaucracies and in the seamline and tensions between local and central governance, or local and central local governments or local communities and the central government, because that's the built-in tension in empires or in any government. So that's one thing. I was interested in bureaucracies, and they were interested in pirates. Also, this was not my field. My previous work was about military bureaucracies and land warfare. So before I started my research, I had to educate myself about piracy, trade, smuggling, maritime history, and naval history. So I read social and political histories on pirates, like Redeker's and Ritchie's and Starkey's, but I also read legal histories and economic histories and cultural histories and maritime histories, works on crime in the 18th century. So I was influenced by the logic and approach of legal scholars and borderlands historians, which made me more sensitive or attuned to issues of center and periphery. And this colored the way I interpreted some of the same sources that Redeker and his compatriots, allies, or followers looked at. Okay? It's not that I had new sources, it's just that I think I was less credulous about the law. Okay? When people like them read the law, they're more credulous about it reflecting reality. Whereas I saw in the law and in the language of the law and in the increasingly harsh or hysterical language in the law, signals. I saw the law as signaling the aspirations and frustrations of a central government, rather than seeing the law as a reflection of public attitudes beyond London, beyond the seat of the government. And I certainly do not see the law as a depiction of life as it was lived. Okay, and I think we all can see that in our lives. Okay? The law says one thing, take for example illegal drugs, and we see life being very different, or underage drinking. Plus, on top of this, there's evidence of continuous piracy in insurance records, and in the press, or reports about losses at sea, et cetera. You keep seeing, even after the demise of piracy in the 1720s, you keep seeing the effect of piracy in the press, in insurance payments, in American court records and naval records, and petitions and reports to the government about what to do about pirate attacks, and in legislation responding to these petitions. So the law and the court rhetoric are not credible to me because because this evidence from the field suggested that the law and court discourse did not reflect reality. And I think that as a colonialist and someone who buys into the approach and method of, again, the big names in my field in colonial history, people like James Henretta and Jack Green and Bernard Balin and John Philip Reed, when I approached this piracy stuff, I was preloaded with a historical framework of center and periphery. And this issue is central to me when I study colonial societies, when I study the British Empire or the United States. And so it was central to me also when I looked at piracy. And I think that in doing so, I'm following the lead and the mindset of 18th century Britons and Americans on this issue, on the limits of the authority and legitimacy of the central government. I know that this framework was central to their way of living and thinking. So, like, it's not like I'm a stubborn contrarian. I don't care. Like, I'm not invested in the persistence of piracy. If I had found evidence going the other way, the way that Ritchie and Redeker see it, I'd say the opposite of what I'm saying here. It's again, this is not my case. It's and in fact, that's how I started my project. I didn't know. I was following Redeker and Ritchie and Starkey. It's just that the evidence showed me something different, and so I was following their framework and their narrative until I couldn't do so in good conscience. The direction of my research shifted early on from a study of armed conflict between warships and pirate vessels to a study that was focused on efforts of various state agencies, the Board of Trade, the local courts, magistrates, customs agents, parliament, and insurance underwriters, which were very important to me. Focusing on their efforts to change the violent, lawless nature of maritime commerce. And this new direction of research revealed that relatively little had been written on the English public's reaction against such attempts to civilize the Atlantic frontier, and on the difficulties the authorities faced in establishing a new mercantile ethic at sea and port. Read on. Okay, so the question is to expand, asking to expand on why the Royal Navy was not effective as a pirate hunting force. So first, naval captains were not eager to chase and attack pirates in American waters, since they themselves were often engaged in trade for private profit. And naval officers could transport goods and do so by underselling civilian traders, since they did not pay import duties, nor did they have to purchase insurance or otherwise pay for protection from piracy, because they were transporting goods on a warship. Number one. So that's lack of interest, not lack of ability. Also, under the same category of lack of interest, naval captains could supplement their incomes, their and their crew's incomes, by hiring out their vessels to protect merchantmen across pirate and privateer-infested waters. So the presence of pirates along busy trade routes actually represented a good source of safe and easy income for these same naval officers who were charged with the task of targeting and chasing off Atlantic pirates. So the mission worked against their incentives. But discounting the issue of motivation, it was, like I said in the talk, it was beyond their capabilities. Okay? Claims regarding the Royal Navy's ability to effectively police the Atlantic are belied by regular blockade running and extensive contraband trade and smuggling during wartime. Okay? And not only in the Atlantic, but also in the comparably more manageable English Channel. Piracy and contraband trade persisted also in the Mediterranean, which is again an area much smaller and better patrolled and controlled than the Atlantic. Okay, so if we see them unable to, even at times of war when there's a strong incentive, national security incentive, if they cannot control the English Channel, if they cannot control the Mediterranean, it strains credulity to believe that they could do so in the Atlantic. And again, like I said, the blockade running, okay? Even blockading a port could not be done for long effectively. Fourth, navies in the 18th century and still in the early 19th century did not have the capacity and ability to seal coastlines and police maritime trade routes at sea. Okay, so and again, this inability becomes much more pronounced in the vast expanses of the Atlantic Ocean. We see that warships were effective at deterring pirates. Okay, so when they escorted a convoy, they were good at deterring pirates from attacking, but they were not effective in chasing and capturing them in open waters. And in this respect, in terms of the records, one shouldn't read too much into the well-publicized stories of the Royal Navy's successful attacks on pirates in the early 18th century. And during that time, the Navy allegedly suppressed the pirate trade into non-existence. For example, the famous stories about the capture of celebrity pirates like Blackbeard and Roberts, because after all, these kinds of success stories resulting in capture, prosecution, conviction, and execution. These kinds of stories existed also during the height of the golden age of piracy. Okay, so we see captures and prosecutions and convictions and executions even during the heyday of piracy, and we don't see that as evidence of a diminution of the trade, or as evidence that the scope of piracy was declining. Quite the contrary. We call it the golden age of piracy. So these kinds of anecdotes, these kinds of captures, especially of celebrity pirates, in the 16th century and 17th century, and still in the golden age, and still in the 18th century, shouldn't be taken as indicative of an overall naval effectiveness against pirates, nor of anti-piracy activism on the part of naval captains, nor of a moral rejection of piracy in English communities, or even in the Navy. So, you might ask, okay, so if we shouldn't read too much into naval attacks and captures of celebrity pirates, then what should we read into them? So, a good observation, the Crown and Parliament had been attacking piracy through the law and by claiming state jurisdiction at sea for a very long time. Okay? So we know better than to read too much into that rhetoric and into those acts of formal legislation, again, statutory law, we know better than to read too much into that when it happens in the 16th and 17th century. Okay, we have these captures, and yet we accept it as the golden age of piracy, and we see piracy flourishing and local communities embracing it and everything else. So all I'm recommending is that we continue doing so in the 18th century. And if you ask what should we read into these captures, perhaps we should see here a public relations effort on the part of either on the part of the Admiralty vis-a-vis Parliament, the Admiralty's effort to show Parliament that it is an effective arm of the government, or a public relations on the part of Parliament vis-a-vis the public, to show the public that we, the central government, can reach into the depths of the ocean and into your ports and make the law real. Despite what you see, that the law means nothing, that the law is a hollow declaration. Here, we're demonstrating once in a blue moon that we mean business and that we have the capabilities. So maybe that's what we should make of it. But again, all I'm saying is that we should look at the 18th century the same way that we look at the 17th and 16th century. The rhetoric, the laws are there. Occasional captures and executions are there, and yet the scope of the pirate trade, of commerce raiding, continues to increase, and the legitimacy of the trade in local communities too. Okay, so the question is, how do I deal with Rediker's statistical data about piracy, about the decline of piracy? So Rediker charts the decline of Atlantic piracy by calculating the number of active Anglo-American pirates with and the result is that he sees is that piracy reaches a low of only 200 in 1726. Okay, so again, this burst of naval activism against pirates and prosecutorial activism, suppression, violence, execution, and by the mid 1720s, there are only 200 active pirates. The issue that it's not me, others have taken with Rediker's computing system is that it's based on the number of Anglo-American ships that were mentioned in British court records and other public accounts, press, etc. Unaccounted for are pirate crews operating on non-English ships or ships that did not make it into the public record. Okay. And Rediker isn't alone in this method of counting pirates. Robert Ritchie and Shirley Hewson date the demise of piracy in the 18th century based on a decline in the volume of pirate trials. So I would suggest that relying on the number of piracy trials is a tricky proposition, given that only a fraction of criminal trials in the 18th century in Britain and in British North America were subject to print reporting. Okay? And most of the trials committed to print are recorded without the details of the proceedings. Okay? Most notably accounts of testimony and argumentation. So there's a lot of criminal activity in the courts that is not reported, or that is reported without telling us what was going on. More important, you have to keep in mind, if you're um, when you study legal history or histories of crime, you need to keep in mind that public concerns over illegal activities, as reflected in criminal prosecutions and journalistic reporting about crime, this kind of public anxiety over illegal activities goes through ups and downs according to fad, according to circumstances, etc. So, for example, in modern society, in our societies, worries regarding offenses like drug abuse, violent crime, tax fraud, illegal immigration. Okay, these worries fluctuate, and because public concern fluctuates, so does criminal prosecutions and news coverage of these activities, of these crimes. Okay? So the fluctuations we see in court cases and the fluctuations we see in the press do not necessarily match the fluctuations in the actual prevalence of these offenses. Okay, for example, underage drinking. Okay. Similarly, a decline in the number of piracy prosecutions and accounts of piracy in the popular press needn't be taken as evidence for a decline in piracy in the 18th century. Okay? So this is true of crime in general. And historians of 18th century crime, like Joanna Innes, for example, point out, or Christopher Hill, point out that the ratio of prosecuted crime to all crime was low. And just like if you look at drug prosecutions in our society compared to drug use. And in this context, changes in prosecution rates tell us more about the behavior and priorities of prosecutors than about the actual lawbreaking among the general public. And again, think of drug abuse, illegal immigration, etc. With regard to piracy specifically, at different times in the 18th and in the 17th and early 18th centuries, the rate of piracy prosecutions declined, especially or routinely before and during wars. And because obviously the government is distracted, well, either that the government is distracted or that it's purposefully lax in law enforcement because it is benefiting from piratical attacks on enemy trade. So, so we see before and during wars a decline in piracy prosecutions. Again, the method that Rediker and his fellows are using. But none of us takes it as indication that piratical attacks were on the decline during the Great Imperial Wars. Okay, it would be silly. Okay, the profits are greater, the opportunities are greater, and the scope of trade is greater because of the wartime economies. Taxes are higher. All the incentives are there for more piratical attacks, and yet we see a decline in prosecutions. Okay, so we know from these cases from wartime that a decline in prosecutions is not a reliable reflection of the scope of piratical activity at sea. And that's especially when you consider the great overlap between pirates and privateers. So the question is, so to get back to the original question, so why then do we see a number of high-profile captures of celebrity pirates in the 1720s? So I would point to maybe three factors. First, like I said, the courts or the Admiralty had always had had a track record of having big pirate captures and prosecutions since the beginning of the golden age of piracy. Okay, so occasionally you catch a big fish. Okay, that's always been the case. Second, actually, I guess I already said that the ratio, the success rate doesn't indicate a more aggressive stance against piracy. So we're back down to two factors. So the second one would be that prosecutors and customs agents and admiralty judges, etc., got the message that that these kinds of prosecutions were not fruitful. So the reason why we have these captures in this generation from the 1690s to the 1720s, and then they stop, perhaps the reason they stop is that the prosecutors who pursued these cases, and the governors and the admiralty judges who pursued these cases, came to see, with the backlash that they received from local officials and local constituents and local merchants and local contributors, they learned that this kind of activism against piracy was not beneficial to them. Okay, that this was not a profitable pursuit politically, economically, in the communities in which they lived. Okay, in Western England, in Scotland, in the Caribbean, and in North America. Okay, so perhaps the prosecutions declined because they faced harsh pushback from their communities because of their attacks on pirates. Okay, a question about the decline of piracy in the 19th century, according to my counting, or my accounting, and the fact that I see it as a result of peace and free trade. So as I said, piracy eventually, in the 1830s and 40s, was ushered out of the Atlantic indirectly and inadvertently, not by pursuing pirates at sea and conducting a jihad on them in the courts, etc., but simply because the profitability of contraband trade declined. And the way I explain this or the way I again, this is not me, I'm tracing, I'm reflecting the scholarship of economic historians who point out that centuries, three or more centuries of near constant war had created economic conditions and tax policies, wartime tax policies, that allowed and encouraged pirates, or that allowed pirates to and smugglers to prosper and multiply in the Atlantic. Okay? The arrival, the fact that peace broke out, a stable peace broke out after the Napoleonic Wars, reversed these these economic conditions that encourage piracy and smuggling. It simply reduced, these activities were still profitable, but much less so, because again, the conditions were no longer there to jack up prices through heightened demand, instability in supply, and and severe trade restrictions, embargoes, high taxes, high tariffs, etc. So as the profits went down, there were other commercial activities that were more profitable. Okay, so and these represent kind of long-term shifts within the Atlantic economy that gradually altered the incentives in favor of commerce and against commerce rating from the 1780s or 90s. Okay, so even before peace changed the economic incentives of commerce rating, you can see from the 1780s or 90s that Atlantic commerce rating, legal and illegal, with a commission and without a commission, that the profit margins were declining when compared to peaceful trade in the Atlantic, and also compared to commerce rating in the Indian Ocean, which had a richer trade. So, so you had this gradual migration of commerce rating from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, which offered richer targets, which was then exacerbated by the peacetime economies after Napoleon, and exacerbated further by free trade in the 1830s and 40s. And you can actually see this, the economic historians who study this show this shift in profitability by looking at the market share of privateering. How many what was the percentage of privateering vessels within the of the total of all merchantmen in this or that war. And so they show that, let's say in the War of Spanish Succession, I forget the numbers exactly, but relatively, if in the War of Spanish Succession, the percentage of privateers compared to all shipping, all commercial shipping, was about 40%. It dropped to about 20% during the French Revolutionary War, and to just 10% during the Napoleonic War. Okay. So it's not that there are fewer privateers, it's just that the scope of shipping blows up. Okay, and so you can see that even though there are plenty of privateers, an increasing percentage of British ships ship owners and captains devoted themselves to commerce rather than to raiding. And this decline in raiding, in privateering or piracy, was done in the face of governments handing out privateering commissions like candy. Okay? So they encouraged privateering, and yet ship owners gravitated more and more and more to the peaceful shipping rather than raiding. And I think, again, it has to do with the fact that ships shipbuilders were able to build larger ships that could carry more cargo, and so the combination of carrying more cargo and delivering a cargo to port and being able to realize those profits was tremendous, and the fact that merchants were covered by insurance for their losses from commerce raiding, and that the losses weren't as great because of the increased use of ransoming rather than taking an entire cargo, a pirate taking an entire cargo. So, so all of these combined meant that commerce raiding became less profitable compared to peaceful shipping in the Atlantic. And eventually this trade migrated, or what was ship owners migrated from commerce raiding to commerce, and migrated, and commerce raiders migrated from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Okay, so it was economic incentives rather than naval suppression. Okay, so there's a question about what exactly, what is the problem with the designation of legal commerce raiders as privateers and illegal ones as pirates. So, so some piracy scholars take the distinction between privateers and pirates very seriously. But there's, whereas others see it as a legalistic mirage, okay, that it's not something that we should take seriously. It's an argument that reflects the legal beliefs of kings and central courts, but not reality at sea or at port. And that there's a near 100% overlap between privateers and pirates. So there's evidence that pirates and privateers targeted similar prizes, went from raiding to peaceful trade and back, and went from commissioned to non-commissioned raiding and back again. Okay. And this overlap between piracy and privateer was evident in everyday practice and therefore also in everyday language. If you look at contemporary correspondence and dictionaries, you see that that to them, the term privateer simply meant a private ship of war and was therefore interchangeable with pirate, filibuster, buccaneer, and freebooter. Okay, so these terms were interchangeable in unofficial usage and even in official documents. Okay, so this lack of clarity between what is a privateer, what is a pirate, what is a filibuster, what is a buccaneer, wasn't simply it's not a symptom of layman's ignorance of the subtleties of the law. You see the same lack of clarity among eminent legal scholars of the time in the 17th and 18th centuries. They were also prone to denying or disregarding the alleged contrast between piracy and privateering. And occasionally, even imperial authorities would you see a royal declaration or a statute using the terms inconsistently. Okay. So basically, to argue, as Redeker et al. Do, that piracy ended in the 1720s, you have to accept the legal pretense that privateers were a different species of maritime predator, which reflects our 21st century understanding of government's authorities and jurisdiction, et cetera, but it really does go against 18th century, the idea that these are two separate species of commerce raiders goes against 18th century practice and beliefs and 18th century language even. Okay, so I think that as historians, we need to follow their lead. Okay, we need to use these to understand these terms in the 18th century. As 18th century sailors and jurists and local officials and central government officials understood them rather than projecting our modern notions of law and jurisdiction onto the 18th century. And you can see it in other maritime crimes. Okay. Wrecking continued through the 18th century into the 19th century. Okay. So if armed commerce didn't go out of style on land, at the shoreline, not on land, in wrecking, we see wrecking understood as a completely legitimate form of trade, let's call it. A completely legitimate way for local people to make a living off of trade or maritime commerce. So if we see this kind of armed commerce not going out of style on land, it makes little sense that it would go away at sea, where it's more lucrative and safer. Okay. It's simply that at sea, we count them as privateers, or some of us count them as privateers. Okay. So those who date the end of piracy in the 1720s insist on a sharp distinction between pirates and privateers. Okay, that again, there are two different types of commerce raiders, and that piracy died, suppressed by force, and it was replaced by state-sanctioned, state-regulated, and state-directed privateering. 18th century Britons and Americans tell us that they did not share this belief. Actually, if you look at these scholars, the scholars who accept the designation of privateer as a legitimate commerce raider, as who is different essentially from pirates, you'll see that they accept this designation of privateer for the great powers, okay, for French privateer commerce raiders, Dutch, Spanish, Americans. But the same scholars, the Redekers, the Starkeys, etc., they would refer, so they make a distinction between pirate and privateer when it's an English privateer or Dutch privateer or Spanish privateer. But when they talk about commerce, about privateers who are on contract for emerging nations like Venezuela and Mexico and Belize, they refer to these privateers, people with commissions from these breakaway republics. They refer to them either as pirates or as bogus privateers. Okay, so you can see in this respect how modern scholars are adopting at face value the legal terminology, the legal aspirations of 18th century great powers. Okay, so they accept the British and French and Spanish pretense that our privateers are bound by law, whereas their privateers of Belize and Mexico and Venezuela, are different. Okay, they're pirates. So this is great power propaganda. This is 18th century propaganda. It's loaded with all sorts of ideological assumptions about which powers are legitimate and which powers are illegitimate. Okay? Which government wields legitimate authority, which government wields illegitimate, or does not wield authority legitimately. Which is fine, this is what governments do, but we historians should not accept this, as reliable reflections of reality. Skip that. So the question about what's the difference between a letter of marque and a privateer. So this is not, so there's a technical difference, but it's not a meaningful one. You can just use them interchangeably. Technically, privateers were commissioned expressly to track and attack enemy ships in order to capture or destroy enemy cargoes. So, so privateers were outfitted as warships to hunt prizes rather than carry cargoes. Okay, this is why crews on privateers received only a cut of the prizes they captured rather than receiving daily wages. By contrast, letters of marque, technically, were letters that were offered, were commissions that were offered to merchant vessels who were conducting their commercial activity. And these letters authorized them to seize enemy ships they happened to come across along their designated route. Okay, so, so again, so one is designated for a professional hunter, and the other one for a merchant vessel who can be an occasional hunter. And also letters of marque were a bit more restrictive than privateering commissions in terms of identifying who the enemy was. But like I said, the distinction was in most cases academic, since the commissions carried by both types of vessels was virtually identical. Let's see. Okay, so there's a question here about the, what kind of distinctions I make between the state and the local community or the local government. So again, don't want to get too into the weeds here, but it is a bit epistemological. By the state, I mean the monarch, the Privy Council, the Board of Trade, the Navy, the Admiralty Courts, the Customs Service, colonial imperial employees like governors, the Coast Guard, I think I mentioned. So that's the state. Whereas by local government, I mean municipal governments, colonial assemblies, local judges and court officials and local juries. I'm assuming that the question alludes to the overlap between the two categories. You can have metropolitan agents like colonial governors or customs officers and admiralty judges who are, and naval officers who are agents of the central government, agents of the state, but they operate in local communities. And so they come to share the circumstances and therefore the interests and therefore the perspective of local people. Okay, so they might, even though they're agents of the state, they might come to share the values and beliefs of their local colleagues and associates and neighbors. So it's a methodological, it's a categorical problem that we recognize. And we today, looking back, we recognize this problem, but it was an administrative problem that they recognized at the time and tried to address. So royal governors and admiralty judges who were deemed as too attentive and too sympathetic to local concerns rather than being attentive and sympathetic to royal concerns or parliamentary concerns were removed from office. People like the most famous, I think, was Governor Shirley from Massachusetts, who was seen as being too strong an advocate for his colonial constituents and therefore not an aggressive enough advocate for the king. Also, the customs service moved customs officers from town to town because they recognized that living in a local community made these people over time more, what they would say, corruptible. What maybe customs official would say, more sympathetic to the views and circumstances and beliefs of the community in which they lived. And these officers usually were not allowed to serve in their hometowns or counties for the same reason. So it's a tricky thing, but it's part of it goes. It's a feature of imperial studies where you're constantly aware of this, the seams and the tensions between the central and the local. Okay, so there's a question about what I said about how merchants who engaged in smuggling and in contraband trade and trading with the enemy, etc., were not unpatriotic. That the people at the time did not see illegal trade as illegitimate or unpatriotic. And I guess the easiest case, the easiest way to discuss is to look at illegal trade. I'm sorry, trade with the enemy in wartime. Which seems to us as the clearest case of unpatriotic activity. The idea that these merchants are to be judged by what they do rather than by but by trading with the enemy, not by what they say, meaning their professions of loyalty and patriotism, is clearly valid. In fact, we usually judge people's actions as more revelatory than their words. So I agree with this critique or this observation, but only to a point. So before we deal with that, let's deal with the fact with what they're actually doing. Okay, so if we're not going to judge them by what they say, but by what they do, let's look at all the things they do. Okay, so they're not just trading with the enemy; they're doing other things. We see these same merchants, again, respectable members of their community, acting, again, not with their words, but with their acts, with their deeds, acting as loyal patriots in a variety of other realms, providing military service, providing support for the military in various ways, providing charitable contributions to widows and orphans, soldiers' charities, etc. While also operating in the marketplace in ways, trading with the enemy or avoiding customs duties, etc., in ways that actually were sanctioned, were deemed acceptable by generations-old custom. So again, you might say that it was generations of disloyalty, but look, we see the status of these merchants who are, again, conducting illegal trade, contraband trade, trade with the enemy. We see their status in their communities. Okay? It's clear that they and their neighbors and their local governments did not see their actions, their commercial actions in the marketplace, as illegitimate, criminal, or unpatriotic. Okay, so it's at the very least possible that all these people were sincere in their belief. So it's just that they had a different look. I'll give an example of economic behavior of the distinction we can make between a person's commitment to his community and a person's behavior in the marketplace. So we believe that when a greengrocer sells fruit, or when a multinational corporation sells grain or oil, the price is set by the market. Okay? And the price for criminals and enemies is the same price for friends and allies. So, so the seller who has material interest in this sale, and we, the observers, who don't have a material interest in the sale, all of us accept that the seller is not showing support for these bad actors, for criminals and enemies of the United States, by selling goods in the international market at the market price. Yeah, because for whatever reason, all of us have come to accept that certain commercial activities on the international stage are not part of civics. Okay, if you're selling oil in the international market and it winds up in China, which is our enemy, our rival, it doesn't indicate that you are a pro-China agent. Okay, so it shows you that we too, just like those 18th century merchants and constituents, can distinguish between behavior in the marketplace and civic commitment to the community or to the state. The difference is between us and those 18th century people is which activities we include in this category, in this category, yeah. Okay. And also we need to remember they were having this exact same debate that we're having now. Okay, this accusation of disloyalty was hurled at them at the time by the central government. And they and their neighbors and their local officials denied it, responded, engaged in a debate with the national government, explaining that adhering to local custom was not an act of disloyalty. Okay, so if, for example, if you look at the American rebels in 1775 or 1765 even, with the Stamp Act riots, or if you look at the many people in Britain that supported the American rebels or the Americans' resistance up until the first shots were fired. Okay? The debate that Americans and their British supporters were having with the imperial government was a debate on whether the new law or the old custom was legitimate. Okay? Which was more legitimate? The crazy new law that you passed, or the good old venerable custom that we've always lived by, or vice versa? Okay, so there's no need for us to assume that one side in that debate was insincere in their beliefs. If we take the agents of the representatives of the central government as sincere in explaining their side of the debate, that these activities are illegal and illegitimate, there's no reason to assume that the other side is just mouthing excuses and are insincere in explaining their understanding of the law, of propriety, etc. And again, there's scholarship on trade, for example, in the British Channel. Even in times of war, it was understood that trade between French and English fishermen continued despite wartime because, again, they came to this understanding that this activity has nothing to do with civics, just like we do. okay, for whatever reason. And you can understand why in terms of the economics and the fact that these are perishable goods that are essential to the survival of local communities. But this question brings up the broader issue of what people say versus what they do. And look, I try not to be a Pollyanna about it, but as I said about assuming that both sides are sincere in their explanations and the justifications they give for their actions, my approach towards people in the past is the same as my approach towards people in the present. You know, people that I deal with in my own life, my colleagues, my relatives, my neighbors, friends, merchants and politicians that I read about in the paper. I assume that my friends and colleagues and family aren't trying to pull one over me when they explain their motivations for doing this and that. Okay, but I think most of them are sincere in stating their beliefs. Their beliefs might strike me as silly or inconsistent or whatever else, but people really do explain sincerely what motivates them to do this or that, or what motivates them to understand a legal case this way rather than that case, this way rather than that way. And of course, if there's evidence of deceit, then that's something else. But barring that, that's how I see, you know, that's how I experience my discussions with people that I know. And I think there's no reason to approach 18th century people differently than we do 21st century people. Okay, so there's no reason for me to assume that the people that I know personally are different from people that I don't know, either people who live beyond my my circle of acquaintances today, or people who live beyond my circle of acquaintances in the 18th century. So it's a, I don't know if it's a methodological difference or a psychological one or character one, but I think an observer needs to be consistent. Okay, consistent, you know, judging people you know and judging people you don't know by the same standard, and so that applies to people that you're reading about in court records and people that you happen to see with your own eyes. Okay, so a question about the public's adherence or a public sympathy for pirates and resistance to anti-piracy campaigns. So the most famous case of local officials who cracked the whip against pirates and then suffered the consequences was Lord Bellamont of the governor of New York in the late 17th century. His constituents in New York, as well as his subordinates, you know, customs officials, admiralty judges, naval officers, were resistant to his crusade against pirates and their and the people who worked with them, supported them, traded with them, etc. In fact, his staff and again, constituents were obstructionists. He was vilified by all because his move against those merchants that he called pirates and criminals it was injurious to the economic interests of his constituents and local allies, but also it really was seen as illegal. Okay, the legal reasoning was novel, and seen as controversial. Okay, so people had interest to economic interest to maintain their ancient legal beliefs, but that doesn't mean that their beliefs were not sincere. Bellamont himself had economic interest, trying to please his superiors in pursuing in holding his legal beliefs too. Okay, but we don't see that as marking him as insincere in his beliefs. Look, the most important thing to remember is that virtually all merchants directly engaged or invested in armed commerce. It was the norm, not the exception. Okay. The control of, in terms of the legal beliefs of people at the time and why they, so look, piracy, wrecking, smuggling, first of all, they had the, not cachet, the legitimacy of antiquity. Okay? These were ancient trades that were always practiced in our community. So that's always already a tremendous factor that speaks for them in the minds of people. Merchants, consumers, local officials, etc. But the other thing is this issue of legal beliefs. Okay? So the control of maritime traffic has been an effective naval tool against rival governments and non-state, terrorists, pirates, etc. It's a relatively safe method compared to actual combat operations on land, and it could be effective in the long run, but this sphere of government action and controlling maritime traffic involves a set of cultural and legal assumptions regarding state jurisdiction at sea that, assumptions that legitimize the government's right to police the seas and to conduct blockades in wartime and peace. Look, in our 21st century lives, we see that these assumptions have been on display in legal debates and in actual policy regarding, a naval blockade that NATO imposes on Libya or Serbia or Iran or efforts to police pirate-infested waters off the coast of Africa, or debates about oil exploration rights in the China Seas, for example, or the Arctic Ocean. So these discussions reveal the ways in which war and other forms of international conflict force modern societies and governments and legal scholars to articulate their views of the sea in relation to state sovereignty. Okay, so is the sea an extension of the geopolitical world order? Is the sea something different? Is it a commons where we govern it together? Is it a no man's land? Is it some sort of untidy mix that some regions of the sea are like this, other seas are like that? And so you can see that even today, with our tremendous capacity to control the sea, which is still limited, but much greater than it was back then. So even with our greater capacities and with governments that are much more expansive in articulating their reach and their jurisdiction, even we haven't settled this issue about what the sea is, about whether state jurisdiction can govern the sea. So if we are not sure about it, we can be sure that when they express doubt or rejection of a king's claim to have sovereignty at sea, they had good cause to. Again, if people today have good cause to, certainly people back then had cause to, because again, the notion was much more novel at the time, and the capacity was much smaller. Okay, time is time is racing, so let me skip this issue about the deference that modern people give statutory law compared to the deference that those people gave to common law, which is true. But I just don't want to keep you too long, so let me skip ahead. Okay, so there's a question about the details about convoying. So convoying was a well-established practice in the early 18th century, which was offered to merchants in both wartime and peace. Wartime against enemy raiding, and in peacetime against pirate activity. But convoying works more smoothly in trades that were monopolized, or worked more effectively in trades that were monopolized. So large sums of money paid in import duties by commercial giants like the Dutch East India Company or the British East India Company or the Levant Company gave national governments a strong incentive to protect company ships, okay? Because these companies paid a large customs bill to the central government. In trades that were more competitive and less centralized, especially in wartime economies that routinely featured sharp spikes in demand, profits for individual ship owners, again, not these giants, profits depended on arriving to market first before convoyed vessels arrived at port simultaneously, thus flooding local markets and lowering retail prices. So in this context, convoys represented considerable disincentives for merchants, which is why both underwriters and the central government attempted, respectively, the underwriters attempted to coax merchants into convoying, and the government attempted to compel merchants into convoying. So insurers did so by offering lower premiums to merchants who chose to partake in convoys, while governments attempted coercion by legislating it and by imposing a tax to fund naval convoys. Okay, so thank you very much for the questions, and if you have further questions or observations or critiques, please email me, and I'll respond. We'll continue it there. Thank you. Bye-bye. Good afternoon.